1 acre of Pennsylvania Dutch ground back in 1897 fed an entire family through the coldest winter of that decade. Not 1 pound of store-bought sugar ever crossed that family's threshold across that entire hard winter season. A perennial root pulled from garden soil that October tasted exactly like an apple and a spoonful of honey combined. That root sweetened porridge, sweetened winter parsnip stew, and sweetened grandchildren's mouths straight through spring thaw. A full row of it grew behind the henhousing ground that never once received purchased fertilizer. It returned on its own the following year, growing back from roots simply left behind in the soil. Neighbors up and down that same valley grew the exact same row, since nearly every farm did back then. Today, most Americans have never once heard the actual name of that specific perennial root vegetable. Walking into any modern garden center and asking for it by name typically earns nothing but a blank stare. Seed racks don't carry it, county extension offices rarely teach it, and nurseries simply don't stock it anymore. Here's the genuine twist though. That plant never actually quit growing or stopped tasting like apple and honey. A federal seed vault in Colorado still keeps its seed preserved carefully to this very day. A handful of dedicated older gardeners across a few states still keep it growing behind their own houses. It simply quietly left store shelves one particular year, and nobody really came looking for it afterward. The actual record shows the reason it left had genuinely nothing to do with the plant itself failing. Several plants covered here got deliberately pruned off shelves because there was no repeat money in something grown once. One heritage chicken breed on this list now has fewer than 500 birds left alive nationally. Congress passed a law back in 1970, ensuring seed grown today legally belongs to somebody else entirely. That gap between forgotten knowledge and modern grocery dependence rarely gets noticed until someone actually measures it. That same apple and honey root still sits in a federal vault since almost nobody plants it anymore. None of these faded from use because they genuinely stopped working for the families who once relied on them. They faded because someone eventually found a way to sell what earlier generations simply grew for free. That outcome was never really anyone's personal fault, since these industries proved genuinely skilled at creating dependence. A pantry stocked properly once meant an entire family survived winter without relying on a single grocery run. The real difference was never really about available money. It always came down to accumulated practical knowledge instead. That knowledge nearly disappeared entirely, and recovering it is really the entire point of this countdown. First on this list, a shade-loving perennial green that fed families' greens from March straight through October. It grew in a shady yard corner where almost nothing else would successfully take root and thrive. You cook it exactly the way you'd cook spinach, using the tender leaves in nearly any spinach recipe. Seed cost nothing after that very first packet, since the same crown reliably returned every single spring. Modern stores now charge around $4 for a plastic bag of pre-washed spinach lasting barely 3 days. This particular green quietly left seed racks around 1955 as catalog companies favored annuals over hardy perennials. Annuals required repurchasing every single year, while this perennial only ever required buying seed one single time. Some university extension programs still list it today for anyone willing to search a little further. 1 packet, 1 shady corner, and greens for essentially the rest of a gardener's entire life follow. Second, an open pollinated corn variety that fed the American South and Midwest for roughly 150 years. It ground into meal, fattened hogs, fed chicken flocks, and reliably dropped viable seed for next year's planting. A single perennial, planted once outperforming an annual repurchased every year, is a pattern worth noticing throughout this list. Farmers once saved a bushel of the very best cobs off their field every single fall without exception. They never needed to purchase corn seed again across their entire working lifetime under that older system. Then during the 1930s, a businessman commercialized hybrid corn seed through a major seed company nationally. By 1960, almost nobody in the entire country still grew corn that would come true from its own kernel. Federal germplasm banks still preserve these older open pollinated corn varieties, and some seed companies still sell them. Grinding it for cornbread, feeding it to a flock, and saving the best ears keeps this cycle running forever. Third, a hardy legume that fed the American South through summers so brutally hot nothing else would properly fruit. It left the ground, it grew in noticeably richer than it originally found that same soil beforehand. This particular pea pulls nitrogen directly out of the air, fixing it into the soil through its roots. Rotating a bean row into a corn row historically cut an entire farm's fertilizer bill down to zero. Modern stores now charge around $30 for a 50-pound bag of chemical fertilizer, doing that same job. This crop largely left catalog racks during the 1960s, once chemical fertilizer companies convinced farmers chemistry beat rotation. Some university programs still actively test heritage varieties of this legume, and seed remains available through specialty suppliers. A single packet feeds both a family and the surrounding ground, without ever generating a recurring bill for either. Fourth, a heritage wheat variety brought to Kansas in 1874 by immigrant farmers carrying seed in their coat pockets. It fed the American breadbasket for roughly 80 years off seed that reliably came true every single fall. A family growing just a quarter acre could realistically eat bread throughout an entire winter season from that harvest. In 1970, a federal law let seed companies begin patenting grain varieties for the very first time nationally. Watching an entire industry benefit from forgetting is exactly the pattern connecting nearly every item covered here. By the late 1970s, a farmer saving his own wheat seed could actually face legal consequences for doing so. This particular wheat variety nearly vanished entirely before regional wheat commissions and small mills brought it back recently. It grinds into bread flour that stores now charge around $9 per loaf to sell back to customers. A pound of properly saved seed plants an entire garden row, while also providing next year's seed supply. Fifth, the humble rain barrel and cistern system nearly every older farmhouse relied on for basic water needs. Families drank, cooked, washed, and watered gardens entirely off rain the sky provided completely free of charge. Federal soil conservation programs actively taught cistern construction techniques well into the 1940s across rural America. Rural water utilities then expanded through the 1950s and 60s, and the water meter gradually took over completely. Stores now charge around $1.50 for a bottle of essentially the same water falling on any roof. University extension programs still publish detailed cistern and rain barrel construction plans for anyone interested today. A 500-gallon barrel positioned under a shed roof can water an entire garden through peak summer months. Checking local county regulations before drinking collected rainwater matters, along with never skipping a proper first flush diverter. A screened lid also matters enormously for keeping debris and pests out of any stored rainwater supply. Sixth, a single dairy goat capable of giving a family roughly a gallon of milk daily for 10 months yearly. That production comes entirely off pasture, browse, and simple kitchen scraps without requiring expensive purchased grain. She kids every single spring, providing an additional animal along with continued milk and optional meat production. Stores now charge around $5 for a gallon of milk from a cow the buyer will genuinely never meet. Grocery chains crowded family dairy operations off the map through consolidation efforts across the 1950s and 60s. Backyard goats shifted from being a genuine household necessity into becoming viewed as a purely optional hobby. Old university records and federal seed vaults quietly preserved knowledge most modern gardeners never think to check. A milk goat does tie a household down morning and night, requiring twice daily milking without many days off. She will still eliminate a household's dairy bill entirely while providing a new kid nearly every single spring. Seventh, home-rendered lard. Since families once rendered an entire year's cooking fat off a single hog each November. A single hog gives 30 to 40 pounds of leaf lard and back fat under proper processing conditions. Lard rendered cleanly in a low oven keeps for a full year when stored properly in a cool cellar. In 1911, a major food company marketed hydrogenated cottonseed shortening as supposedly cleaner than traditional animal lard. By the 1950s, an entire generation had genuinely never seen cooking fat rendered directly from a raised animal. Stores now charge around $6 for a can of oil that never came anywhere near an actual hog. Nutrition research has since reversed its earlier stance, no longer treating traditional laird as some kind of dietary villain. A hog fed primarily on kitchen scraps costs remarkably little beyond what a household already throws away regularly. 8th, sweet sorghum, grown across much of the South and Appalachian Range before cane sugar refiners dominated completely. Farmers crushed this cane using horse-driven mills, boiling the juice down into dark, rich molasses syrup. That syrup sweetened biscuits, oatmeal, and coffee across an entire year from just one modest growing season. 1 acre alone could yield roughly 100 gallons of finished syrup under proper processing conditions historically. Syrup Milling Day once functioned as a genuine fall social event, bringing entire rural counties together annually. Sugar refining consolidation during the early 1900s gradually put most local syrup mills entirely out of business. By 1970, working sorghum mills had become genuinely difficult to find within many entire regions of the country. A few dedicated operations still run today, and a single seed packet grows an entire productive sorghum bed. A recurring bill replaced by a one-time planting is the underlying theme running through this entire countdown. 9th, muscadine grapes, growing wild across the American South long before any European grapevine ever crossed the ocean. Nearly every older farm ran an arbor of these vines along a smokehouse or similar outbuilding wall. These vines produced grapes for eating fresh, for jelly, and for wine across generations without much maintenance required. They lived for roughly 100 years without spray, without regular pruning, and without any professional nursery care. Commercial wine production eventually standardized on European grape varieties, pushing muscadines toward being labeled purely ornamental. University breeding programs never actually stopped developing improved muscadine varieties, despite that commercial market shift occurring. One vine set once can realistically keep producing fruit across 4 full human generations without replanting. Stores now charge around $5 for a small pint of grapes shipped from halfway around the world. 10th, salsify, sometimes called the oyster plant, grown widely in kitchen gardens across America into the 1950s. This long taproot tasted remarkably like a mild oyster, once properly fried in butter for a family meal. It fed households through winter, directly out of simple cellar storage bins, without requiring any special equipment. Around 1954, federal agencies effectively dropped this vegetable from official commercial vegetable listings entirely nationwide. Grocery chains stopped stocking it, and it never really returned to mainstream seed racks after that point. Some specialty seed companies still carry salsify today for gardeners willing to seek it out directly. One honest caution matters here. Wild parsnip growing in ditches looks visually similar, and its sap can genuinely burn skin. Growing salsify only from a known, deliberately planted garden bed avoids any confusion with that dangerous look-alike plant. 11th, the sunchoke, or Jerusalem artichoke, feeding indigenous farmers across the eastern woodlands centuries before European settlement arrived. It also helped carry many families through the Great Depression on genuinely difficult, marginal farmland conditions. None of these plants or animals required rare conditions. Most simply required patience and a willingness to wait. This tuber returns every single year from whatever gets left behind in the ground after harvesting. It thrives even in genuinely poor soil, where almost nothing else would successfully grow or produce food. Federal agricultural policy during the 1970s pushed farmers toward corn and soybeans, treating perennial tubers as mere weeds. Some university small farm programs still actively trial sunchokes today, studying their genuine agricultural potential seriously. Stores now charge around $7 a pound for this same tuber sold in a specialty produce aisle. Growing a bed at the back of a yard where nothing else thrives works well for this resilient crop. 12th, heritage dual-purpose chicken breeds bred during the 1800s, specifically to forage most of their own feed. These birds laid roughly 200 eggs yearly, while still dressing out large enough for a proper Sunday meal. In 1948, a major poultry competition selected a fast-growing hybrid bird that grew twice as fast on feed. Heritage flocks got largely pushed aside afterward in favor of that faster-growing commercial hybrid alternative instead. Conservation organizations now list some of these older breeds as critically endangered, with only a few hundred birds remaining. A heritage hen working for her own feed accomplishes something purely industrial breeds simply cannot manage anymore. A small flock fed on scraps and yard insects lays reliably through the year at essentially zero ongoing cost. 13th, the basic laying flock itself, since 8 hens on a quarter acre can produce a dozen eggs daily. That output requires managing them the traditional way, a coop shut tight at dusk and rotated across fresh grass, kitchen scraps each evening paired with a handful of cracked corn. Each morning rounds out that simple routine. University research shows a heritage bird can forage 60 to 70% of her own feed off good pasture. Stores currently charge around $4.50 per dozen for essentially the same basic product. Losing birds to predators occasionally happens to nearly everyone keeping a flock, and that's a genuinely normal learning experience. Reclaiming even one of these old practices tends to make the next one feel far less intimidating to attempt. 14th, backyard beekeeping. Since a single hive can give a family roughly 50 pounds of honey yearly, older generations often kept several colonies in simple log hives positioned behind an outbuilding for decades continuously. Cheap imported honey started appearing in grocery chains during the 1930s, and by the 1970s, home hives grew rare. Stores now charge around $8 a pound for honey that traveled thousands of miles to reach that shelf. A simple top-bar hive built from scrap lumber can supply a family's sweetener needs for an entire year. That same hive also pollinates every fruit tree growing anywhere nearby on that same property simultaneously. Federal agriculture agencies still list beekeeping among the most recommended backyard operations for interested small property owners. Checking local county regulations regarding hive registration matters before setting up a first hive on any property. 15th, alternative sap trees beyond maple, since box elder, black walnut, and river birch all produce genuinely boilable sap. All 3 species grow wild across Appalachian and Midwest regions on land many people don't even personally own. Earlier, settler and native families tapped birch just as often as they tapped traditional sugar maple trees. Commercial syrup production eventually standardized entirely on sugar maple, and the other 3 species quietly dropped from awareness. Some university maple programs now publish research covering these often overlooked alternative sap-producing tree species. Stores currently charge around $18 per quart for maple syrup sold through typical retail grocery channels. A single mature black walnut tapped properly in February can yield roughly 2 gallons of sap daily for weeks. 16th, the pawpaw, the largest native fruit found anywhere across North America, growing wild from Kansas to the Atlantic. Its flesh tastes remarkably like a cross between mango and banana, according to most people who've tried it. Earlier generations ate pawpaws by the bagful during their short harvest window each September across many regions. A single row, a single hive, or a single hen can realistically be the entire starting point for anyone. Commercial fruit distribution never could handle pawpaws well, since the fruit bruises badly within just a single day. That shipping difficulty meant pawpaws never really made it into standard grocery store produce sections nationally. One university runs the country's only dedicated pawpaw breeding program today, studying improved varieties actively. A single mature pawpaw tree can give roughly 50 pounds of fruit yearly across a lifespan of decades. One honest note matters here: only the flesh gets eaten, never the skin or the seeds of this fruit. 17th, the traditional root cellar, a stone-walled space dug into a north-facing slope staying near 40 degrees. That space required no electricity at all, while keeping potatoes, cabbage, carrots, and apples fresh from October through April. Rural electrification completed by 1947, and by the 1960s, chest freezers largely replaced traditional root cellars nationwide. Stores now effectively charge around $100 monthly in electricity to run a freezer full of food. That stored food spoils entirely the moment the power supply drops for any extended length of time. Some organizations still publish detailed root cellar construction plans for anyone interested in building one today. Proper ventilation matters enormously, since a sealed cellar without adequate airflow will simply rot stored crops quickly instead. 18th, lacto-fermentation, since earlier generations put up an entire year of cabbage and vegetables using only salt and water. Stores now charge around $9 per jar for artisan sauerkraut, made using essentially that exact same traditional method. Home economics classes once taught fermentation techniques regularly in public schools, well into the 1960s nationally. Those specific classes got cut from most public school curricula sometime between 1968 and 1978 across the country. Some agricultural extension programs now publish updated, safety-focused fermentation guides for anyone wanting to relearn this skill. The entire method comes down to cabbage, salt, a crock, a weight, and roughly 3 weeks of cellar time. That kind of modest beginning rarely feels dramatic, yet it consistently builds toward genuine household independence over time. Keeping the vegetable fully submerged under brine matters enormously, since exposed vegetable material invites unwanted mold growth quickly. 19th, open pollinated seed, saving itself, since hybrid seeds sold today deliberately won't come true from its own saved seed. That design forces repeat purchases every single spring, rather than allowing genuine long-term seed independence for growers. An open pollinated bean variety can reliably save itself from a single original packet across many following seasons. The same principle applies equally well to tomatoes, peppers, lettuce, corn, and squash varieties grown from open pollinated seed. Seed preservation organizations work specifically to keep many of these older, genuinely reproducible varieties alive and available. One packet of a properly heritage bean variety, saved faithfully every fall, can feed a family for an entire lifetime. 20th, specific heritage bean varieties that legally slipped through patent restrictions specifically because they belonged to families, not corporations. In 1970, federal law let seed companies begin patenting certain plant varieties for the very first time nationally. By the late 1970s, farmers saving certain patented seed varieties could genuinely face real legal consequences for doing so. Several heritage bean varieties escaped that exact restriction, since no corporation ever formally owned their specific genetic lineage. A 50-foot row of one of these beans could realistically produce 30 pounds of dry beans for storage. Stores now charge around $3 a pound for essentially that exact same variety of heirloom bean. Seed preservation organizations still list and distribute many of these exact heritage bean varieties today for interested growers. 21st, comfrey, a deep-rooted plant pulling minerals up from subsoil layers most other plants never reach. Cutting the leaves 3 times per season and laying them down as mulch feeds garden soil directly and cheaply. Combined with animals rotating across garden beds, fertilizing as they scratch, an entire garden can avoid purchased fertilizer entirely. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer transitioned from a wartime explosive ingredient into farm sales starting around 1947 nationally. By 1960, many American farmers had become genuinely dependent on purchased fertilizer bags costing real money every single season. Every generation that skips passing down this knowledge makes the next generation's rediscovery slightly harder to accomplish. One comfrey crown, planted in a single garden corner, can eliminate an entire garden's fertilizer bill going forward. 22nd, a traditional culinary herb bed featuring thyme, sage, rosemary, oregano, mint, chamomile, and lemon balm together. Earlier generations cooked directly out of that same herb bed every single night across many decades of use. Grocery stores now charge around $3 for a small plastic container holding just a handful of fresh basil leaves. Home economics classes taught herb gardening regularly until those specific programs got cut from schools during the 1970s. Growing the bed, drying the leaves, and filling storage jars provides herbs reliably for roughly an entire decade. 23rd, the humble potato, since a 100-foot row of a solid variety, yields roughly 200 pounds. That harvest comes from ground that otherwise often sits completely unused, using seed potatoes saved from previous harvests. Both earlier Irish immigrants and American colonists relied heavily on potatoes as a genuine dietary staple crop historically. Home economics and agriculture classes teaching potato cultivation got cut from many public schools during the mid-1970s. Some specialty seed potato suppliers still sell many older heritage potato varieties for interested home gardeners today. Stores now charge around $4 for a modest 5-pound bag of standard grocery store potatoes. Roughly $20 of seed potato planted each spring can realistically cover an entire family's winter starch needs. 24th, Skirret, the exact perennial root mentioned at the very start of this entire countdown discussion. Pulled from the ground in October and eaten raw, it genuinely tastes like apple mixed with honey. That flavor comes with no exaggeration and no sales pitch attached. It simply tastes remarkably sweet and pleasant. Pennsylvania Dutch farmers grew entire rows of this exact root across generations of continuous family gardening. It appeared in mainstream seed catalogs until around 1902, then quietly got dropped since it was genuinely perennial. That's exactly why documenting and sharing these older methods matters as much as actually practicing them personally. Planted once, gardeners simply dug divisions off that same crown for the rest of their entire lives afterward. There was never much repeat money in a root. Customers only ever needed to buy seed for once. A federal seed preservation system still keeps this exact root's seed safely stored to this very day. Some specialty heirloom seed companies now carry it again for gardeners interested in growing this forgotten crop themselves. It grows wild without much care in ordinary garden soil, needing no fertilizer and no regular spraying whatsoever. It sweetens porridge, sweetens tea, and sweetens a child's mouth standing right beside that same garden row. 25th and final. Not really a single plant, animal, or skill, but genuinely all of them together at once. Every root, every row, every hen, and every hive combined together, standing in one yard, feeding one family. That represents the genuinely self-fed homestead, the root crop by the kitchen door, and the sorghum growing out back, the hens in a coop shut tight at dusk, and the goat grazing quietly along the property line nearby. The comfrey pulling minerals upward, and the bean row quietly saving its own seed, year after year. The cellar tucked under the porch, and the crock of fermented cabbage sitting steadily on a nearby shelf. The pawpaw tree at the edge of the woods, and a tapped tree collecting sap each February reliably. The seed jar sitting in the pantry, and the beehive humming quietly in one corner of the property. That was never really a hobby, or a passing lifestyle trend. That was simply how earlier generations genuinely lived. They weren't poor by any honest measure. They were fed, genuinely free, and beholden to no outside store. That original Pennsylvania farmer lived to 89 on ground. His own children kept working for generations afterward. That table never once needed a purchased sugar bowl across the entire span of that long, productive life. None of this requires rejecting modern convenience entirely. It simply requires remembering what genuine alternatives once existed. The historical record reversed itself eventually, because these plants and methods genuinely kept their original promise all along. Seed vaults kept the seed safe, and the knowledge simply waited patiently for someone willing to come reclaim it. Every single item covered here represents a bill many households had genuinely forgotten. They could simply stop paying. Everyone represents a piece of earlier ground that's genuinely still possible to walk back onto this very year. None of this suggests a single small window box could realistically feed an entire family on its own. This isn't about fear or doom. This is genuinely about thrift, dignity, and reclaiming forgotten practical knowledge instead. Some practices mentioned here, raw milk, home butchery, and roof-caught drinking water, face real local legal restrictions. Checking specific local regulations before attempting any of these practices matters enormously for staying genuinely compliant. So here's a genuine, simple starting point worth considering. Picking just one single item from this entire list. Planting one packet of a heritage bean variety in a 50-foot row makes a genuinely solid start. Keeping 3 hens on kitchen scraps inside a coop shut tight every night represents another realistic starting point. Starting a small comfrey patch in an otherwise unused yard corner offers yet another accessible entry point too. Planting one bed of skirret and tasting genuine apple and honey from homegrown ground next October works too. Just one single item from this entire list represents a genuinely realistic, achievable way to actually begin. So here is a genuine question worth sitting with. Which of these forgotten plants or animals would get tried first? Drop that answer in the comments below, since every single one gets read and genuinely considered afterward. An entire homestead's worth of practical knowledge has quietly been disappearing one older generation at a time. Somebody in every family once grew several of these. They simply never got the chance to pass it down. Now that same knowledge sits available again for anyone genuinely willing to reclaim and actually put it to use.